Hello, welcome to my channel. Autumn is my favorite season. I love Halloween and all the decorations and the bright fall colors on the trees. Today's video is going to be so much fun. I'm going to show you how to use watercolor pencils to paint an amazing jack-o'-lantern, completed with a hat. A full list of the materials I used is in the description below. So let's begin. The secret to create a vibrant watercolor pencil painting is to work in layers and to create lots of contrast. If you have never worked with watercolor pencils, let me give you a quick introduction. To use watercolor pencils, simply apply the pigment from the pencils to the paper and activate it with a wet brush. How hard you press will influence the lines that remain visible in the final artwork. Always wait for the paper to be completely dry before applying the next layer, as wet paper is fragile and might break. Do not use printer paper, as this will only lead to frustration. Other thicker papers are better equipped to handle the water without buckling or breaking and soak the pigment up in the fiber, allowing for more layers. I also made a full video with all the basics for beginners, which I will link in the top corner for you. I like to always leave a little gap between the pencil line and the watercolor pencil. Painting the watercolor pencils directly up to the pencil line would mean that I need to draw this exact line 3 times. Once when I paint the outline, once when I apply the watercolor pencil, and once when I activate it with a wet brush. This will increase my chance of slipping up and needing to make corrections or changes to the whole painting. It will be easier to close the gap later on with a wet brush. And it will save some time, as I do not need to draw this line accurately 3 times. In this first layer, I basically take care of the highlights. While I could leave them white, I chose not to. This does decrease the contrast of colors in the painting slightly, but I think it is well worth it, as it adds so much more vibrancy. The highlights on the pumpkin are yellow and the highlights on the hat are a light wash of gray. Let's talk about corrections. When a line did not come out as straight as intended, I try to soak up the pigment with a dry paper towel immediately. Next, I use a damp brush to rub over the affected area and reactivate the pigment. I can then soak up the pigment with a paper towel. Be aware that applying more water to the wet or damp part of the painting will cause blooms. This is why I make sure that the connecting areas are dry-ish and the moist brush is not too wet. Sometimes the pigment stains the paper and it cannot be soaked up. In this case, I make changes to the whole painting. A leaf, for example, might be slightly bigger than in the outline. I might add a background or darken a section more than originally intended. Let's give the first layer some time to dry and then move on to the second layer. With watercolor pencils, same as with watercolors, I work from light to dark. I use the lighter colors first, darkening them with each layer. For the black hat, it is easy. I add more pigment with each layer. For the pumpkin, I use multiple colors. I first use yellow, then orange, then red. You can swap the red for a dark brown if you like. As it is similar to the orange, it might be easier for beginners and less intimidating, as using red can be really over the top. If you're having trouble seeing where to use the darker colors, I suggest to make a quick drawing with pencil only, in black and white. You can always just take a picture of the colored painting and add a black and white filter. It will help you to see where to add darker colors. I'm building up colors with this orange layer, adding it to a wider area around the shadows. This statement will make sense soon, I promise. When activating the watercolor pencil, I like to add some clean water to the highlights first, as this ensures soft transitions. I then work my way around the painting, activating each area. I try to keep a wet edge, but watercolor pencils dry fast. If you accidentally created a hard line, it will be easier to let it dry completely instead of messing around with it now. This will only lift more pigment. You can easily fix it later. chances are high that you will add another layer on top of it anyways. Also, I really like the look of it as long as it is not a straight line. This would just distract in the final artwork. Once the second layer is completely dry, I can move on to the third layer. The paper needs to be completely dry as wet paper is more fragile and breaks easily, especially with those sharp watercolor pencils. The whole purpose of this layer is to add color. I'm rubbing the pencil many times over the paper because I want a lot of pigment to rub off onto the paper. Pressing the pencil harder would be wrong here, as this only causes streaks and lines, which cannot be fully dissolved when activating the watercolor pencil. When you press harder with a pencil, you cause little dents in the paper, which will be visible in the final artwork. I made a whole video about how to use these lines. Check it out, it's in the top right corner for you. There will be room later to define details and shadows, so don't get too worked up about getting the colors in the perfect final spots just yet. Especially the creases of the pumpkin will be defined later with a red color. Clean edges are the most important aspect to achieve in this layer. Let me explain. If you don't add enough pigment yet, you can always add more in another layer. If you get the colors wrong, you can fix that later. But if, let's say, the black watercolor pencil on the left eye ends up almost touching the nose, that's something that is hard to correct or to explain. And also don't forget to change to a smaller brush if it makes your life easier. When you work with a lot of pigment, like in this layer, mishaps can be hard to correct. Some pigments can even stain the paper. This is why I do my best to make sure all of the edges are clean and crisp. Clean outer edges can really make the difference between a child's painting and an adult's artwork. This is one of the things we praise our kids for, right? Staying within the lines. Watercolor pencils do, in general, dry pretty fast and faster than watercolor. This is because not too much water is used. The drying time still feels way too long. To accelerate the drying time, you can use a hairdryer, a heat gun, or placing the painting in a warm spot, like in the sun or near a heater. That can help as well. This is the reason why I rarely paint outside during the summer. Everything just dries way too fast. To be honest, I personally don't usually use any tools like a hairdryer to dry my painting. Instead, I use the time to work on something else, like the next painting or editing a video. I'm really curious to know how you dry your painting. If you let them air dry, what do you do in the meantime? Please let me know in the comments below. For the fourth layer, I'm really concentrating on those shadows. Here, I'm using the darkest colors I have to create shadows. Be aware that we will do one more layer after this one with a more concentrated color, so keep watching before you start to paint this layer. You need to leave a little room for one step darker. Darkening the head is easy, as I only used one color here. When activating the black, I make sure that the transition to the highlighted area is somewhat soft. I'm also taking some of the pigment directly off of the pencil with a wet brush, as it helps me to really darken the shaded areas. Using the watercolor pencil to apply the pigment to the paper first and then activating it, that can be tedious with some colors, especially when you work with cheaper watercolor pencils, which are not as highly pigmented. This can be an easy workaround for you. The pencils I'm using here are of a higher quality, and I still love this trick. Be aware, the pigment you have in your brush when you took it directly off of the pencil is very intense. So applying it to the paper and blending it out can be hard, as it sometimes is simply too much pigment for that particular area. It is still fun to use your materials differently sometimes. It shows you the full extent of their capabilities. The darkest parts of the pumpkin are the creases between the segments. I have been working to build up colors here, and now I'm adding red to it. During the entire painting process, I added layers which were one step darker or more intense than the last one. The area where I added them became smaller and smaller around the actual darkest point. So aren't you wondering why I don't just add the darkest area in one go and let it blend outwards towards the highlight? There are many reasons, but to keep it short, it would just not look the same. The contrast would not be as big, and the imperfect color patches are what makes this look so appealing. Also, a perfect transition is always harder to get right and always harder than an intentionally loose style, which I'm using here. While those perfect blends are definitely a popular painting style, this style is not what I'm going for here. Adding colors in layers means that the previous layers will show through. The orange, for example, makes the red really glow. Another point is that watercolor and watercolor pencils are translucent. If you want a good coverage, you need multiple layers. And let's not forget the most important argument for layers and for watercolor pencils. Painting them is just fun. It's about enjoying the process. Let's finish up this painting with the last layer. I take pigment directly off of the brush to intensify the creases and shadows. I target the very darkest areas here. Paintings are more vibrant if you add more contrast and more saturation. You can achieve this easily by overemphasizing the colors. When you add this last layer, you can really see the painting come together. There are three main benefits to using pigment that you picked up with the brush. The first one is the vibrancy. A common mistake that beginners make is to be too cautious with adding colors, and especially darker colors. This makes your painting look pale and boring. Taking pigment directly off of the pencil with a brush is a great option to add more vibrancy, and it will make it easier and faster to paint as well. The second benefit addresses possible issues with the paper. Some papers are flat by now, meaning no more pigment will stick to the paper when you use a pencil on it, or the paper cannot absorb any more pigment. This is not always an issue with the pencil or the paper, it might just be the paper structure. But using pigment from the brush helps with this, as the pigment is liquidish and can easily stick to the paper. The third benefit addresses the detail work. It might be easier to add pigment to a smaller area with a brush than it is with a watercolor pencil. Accuracy can be a problem with watercolor pencil. Always keeping your pencil sharp does sometimes not help, especially when you need to add the pigment to a smaller area and then activate it with a small damp brush. Why not use the damp brush in the first place? Thank you so much for watching my video. I picked out some more videos I think you might like. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you soon with the next video.